Okay, welcome to week 9, art, aesthetics, and marketing. And this is the week where I would have had a lot of visuals that I would have shown, things I would put up on the screen, clips I would have played in class. I've put some of those into the readings for week 9, but you're just going to have to Google some of this stuff yourself. When I'm talking about different movies, when I'm talking about different art campaign, ad campaigns, that are very aesthetically pleasing, things of that nature. That will just be some extra work you'll need to do in order to understand what it is that I'm talking about. So, talking about kind of art and aesthetics, I think a good place to start is the Bible, with a lot of the stories that are told there, stories which have meant so much to Western society, and in particular, its artistic, aesthetic components through literature, film, art, other such things. I mean, there were periods of time in Western culture where all the art essentially was religious in nature. Where if you were going to be a painter in the 1500s, you essentially painted were stories from the Bible. So it's important. It's important to kind of understand the Bible in this particular instance when it comes to really what's a fascination with food in the Bible. Food plays a big part in a lot of different stories. I mean, ones I didn't even put up here are Joseph with the cows consuming other cows, with the wheat, the sheaves of wheat. Even the dream of the baker and the butler both involve in one of them he picks grapes and makes wine out of the grapes and gives it to Pharaoh to drink, and the other one the poor baker is trying to carry loaves of bread and gets attacked by a bunch of birds and trips and falls, and apparently that's the sign that he's going to die. But I mean, really from the very beginning, from the Adam and Eve and the fruit of the tree of knowledge, popularly depicted as an apple. Who knows? But I've heard sort of like biblical archaeologists say no, it was actually a pear. I mean, it doesn't really matter in one sense. It's a whether or not apples came from whichever region of the world. The point is that a fruit is being used as an example of the consumption of something that it was not meant for, in this case, man, Adam and Eve, and that takes the form of an apple. In our sort of popular way of interpreting this story. Also from the very beginning, the notion that there's actually sort of two different creation accounts in Genesis. One is called the stewardship model. Take care of the animals. You're there to man is there to hold stewardship over. Take care of. And the other one's the dominion model, which is more, I'm giving you these gifts so that you can eat, and really the animals are there for you to slaughter and eat. One seems more like a hunter-gatherer remnant mythology, and another one sounds like a more settled systemic agriculture, which is kind of interesting. But for another very, very early story is very obsessed with what type of foods are considered the proper food for making sacrifice to God in the form of vegetable and meat. Of course, I'm thinking of the story of Cain and Abel, where Cain slays Abel because God finds Abel's sacrifice to be more appealing. And again, why that stories end up in places for a reason. I think the moral, number one, the moral of the story is don't murder. Don't kill your. After the fall, it's the first crime mentioned in the Bible, And but there's also an aspect of what you're sacrificing and whether or not it's more dear to you. Okay, a little bit of a later story: Jacob and Esau. The pottage, selling his birthright for a meal, basically. Um, I mean, there's of course when we get to Moses, um, the the Leviticus code, uh, the preponderance of fruit in the Bible. Very rarely are vegetables mentioned in the Bible, but fruits very, very commonly mentioned. And pomegranates, figs in particular. There's something that they're pretty sure is lemons. It was called by a different name. Grapes, obviously. Wine plays a big role in the Bible. But there's kind of a fascination with food in the Bible. Manna. You remember the quail flesh, and then the manna when the Israelites are trapped on Sinai. The big things of grapes that they find when they moved into the Holy Land. The Old Testament's just chock full of references to food, and it doesn't stop once you get to the New Testament. Okay, wine plays a big role in a lot of the, Jesus Christ and his disciples go to a lot of get-togethers. Okay, there's different, like, almost parties, or one's awake, Lazarus, but clearly wine played a big role in that type of social life of this time period, in the first century A.D. And you have the turning the water into wine miracles, the serving of wine to guests, and things of that nature. And of course, wine would have been a status symbol in the Bible. If you can afford to give wine to your, number one, if you can afford to have guests, and then sort of ply them with wine, that's obviously a symbol of that you have some wealth. And second of all, of course, wine was safer to drink than water, okay? Because the fermentation process in wine killed a lot of the little beasties that they didn't know about at that point, that we do, called germs, various bacteria and whatnot, that could often be swimming around in water that you might drink, but they're going to be dead. You're still going to be drinking them when you drink wine. It's just that they've been killed off by the fermentation process, so wine was a lot safer to drink. And then, of course, we get to the loaves and the fishes, okay? And just the sort of overwhelming metaphor that really runs throughout the Bible of, being fishers of men. Even Paul later, in spreading Christianity, that's essentially what he's doing, casting his net widely. And there's certain scenes, most famously on the Sea of Galilee. Peace be still. The storm. And what essentially one of the only reasons to be out on the water was if you're fishing. So Jesus is a fisherman. Jesus charging his disciples to be fishers of men. The fish as a symbol of increase. This big crowd comes to hear Jesus Christ speak, and all they have is a few loaves of bread and a few fish, and then sort of performing this miracle so that there's bounteous food for everyone. Is a symbol of bounty. It's a symbol of plenty. It's a symbol of growth. It's a symbol of increase. That would have resonated very well with a Christian church that had withstood several hundred years of acrimony and persecution from Rome, and was now just starting to coalesce and spread in the Mediterranean world a couple hundred years after Christ, when these books of the Bible are starting to be set down and coalesced. okay, into kind of larger bodies of work that then get passed along, and things of that nature. So food just plays oh, and then of course I was going to mention, the fish becomes a symbol of Jesus, to the point where some clever evolutionists took that fish symbol, put feet on it, and put the word Darwin in the middle of it. And then some clever Christian graphic designers cracked back on the Darwinists by having a bigger Jesus fish swallowing an upside down Darwin fish. Okay. I don't see those on cars as much as I used to. About 15 years ago, you'd see it very commonly. It was this little culture war that was going on by putting these symbols on the back of your car. You've probably seen a few of these, but they used to be very common. So the Bible is just chock full of examples of, I'm sure there's plenty that you can think of that I didn't, of food and the importance that food played in the role of the people that lived during this time. And you can understand why. There was a lot more famine, or they were more poorly equipped to deal with famine when it came along. There were some fantastically wealthy people, but the majority of people were poor, living meal to meal. And that, I think, shines through in this obsession with food. And maybe the reason the fruit is so widely mentioned throughout the Bible, when food is mentioned in the Bible, it's more than likely to be fruit. I think it's because that was the dessert of the time. That was the sweet of the time. So, that's what people liked. They didn't have ice cream. They didn't have Snickers bars or Butterfinger or Three Musketeers. They had pomegranates and dates and figs, and so that's kind of maybe why it features so much. But then, of course, there's foods that you're also not supposed to eat, right? No pork, Levitican code. No shellfish. Okay. No shrimp, no lobster, no crab. And for ungulates, it's all about whether or not the hoof is split or not. Okay, is it split like a cow, or is it split like a horse? Is it split like a deer, or is it round like a horse or something else that you're not supposed to eat? Okay, so that's the Bible. And like I said, the Bible is certainly number one, and Shakespeare and probably Hamlet number two when it comes to cultural influences. You see biblical metaphors and references and phrases popping up all the time in other art forms, and so it's important to understand that foundational aspect of Western society. Literature, I just put a few on here, just a very few. I do think that there's some early examples of food insecurity that, we're now much more cognizant of this concept and in the sort of psychological impact that it has on young people in particular to not know where their next meal is coming from, or to go to bed hungry. Okay, we're more aware of that today, but they weren't so much in the 19th century. They knew there were poor people, poor kids being raised in orphanages like Oliver Twist, and they knew that people were hungry, but they didn't have the same concept or vision of the lingering effects of food insecurity and what it can do in making some people very productive. They never want to go back to that, so they work very, very hard, work harder than people who didn't grow up with that. But I think Charles Dickens really did kind of understand the human condition a little bit better than a lot of other writers in the 19th century. I always make fun of my mom, why 800 pages? Why didn't he go for 900 pages, Mom? She's a Victorian. She taught Victorian literature, and so I'm always making fun of her for Charles Dickens' books being 800 pages long and seeming like they're 1,500 pages long. But, he really did understand the human condition and understood that hunger was not just something that typified poor versus rich, but had a strong, dominating presence in people's lives. You kind of get the impression that, yes, Oliver Twist and Orphan Annie and, kind of these type of individuals. If you ever watch the show Different Strokes with Willis, and the other character, the Gary Coleman character, that go from sort of being adopted by a wealthy person with tremendous means, from very humble origins. That these kids are going to grow up not wasting anything, even if they do move over from one side of food insecurity to another. So, I just immediately thought of Oliver Twist and knew I had to put it on here. The other ones I'm going to talk about very briefly are really the kind of world building that is done in fantasy, and how fantasy works often have very strong food components to them. And I think one reason why is if we want to learn about a world that's built, constructed for our pleasure, one thing that causes pleasure in life is food. And it's a safe pleasure, too. No one ever criticizes George R. R. Martin's Song of Ice and Fire. Too much sex, too much violence. Okay, well, violence isn't a pleasure. But people criticize him for, there's too much sex. No one ever criticizes, you have too much food in there, right? This is kind of a way that you can really inject pleasing, sort of visceral, sensory enjoyment that's not necessarily intellectual, but more about the satisfaction of the senses in a way that doesn't make anyone feel uncomfortable. Okay, it's G-rated. And you see this in the Chronicles of Narnia, where they just go on and on about these feasts of, lime sherbet ices and raspberry sherbet ices, and there's just all these big long lists of food. And understanding that C.S. Lewis was British and had the ordeal of dealing with British cuisine for the however many years he lived, 65 years, 70 years. You can understand why that would be maybe part of his escapism, is he was imagining these kind of almost Middle Eastern feasts. They're very described almost in sort of like Turkish, Middle East, Eastern Mediterranean terms. That's the Chronicles of Narnia. Harry Potter and A Song of Ice and Fire is a little bit different because it's more made up dishes and made up things. You have magical chocolate frogs and butterbeer and pumpkin juice and all this stuff that you don't see in real life. I think J.K. Rowling was just a little bit more fanciful than the rest of these authors. Most of the rest of these authors. We'll get to Willy Wonka. We'll get to Roald Dahl in just a second. But her food is just recognizable enough that we recognize it, but just weird enough, just a little bit off kilter enough that you can believe that it's part of a magical world that none of the rest of us can enter. I did have this one wonderful moment where my sister got me Bertie's Bott's Beans for Christmas about 6-7 years ago, and I was just really hoping that the first one I would get was earwax, because there's this wonderful line in Harry Potter, in the first Harry Potter, right at the end of the first Harry Potter book, where Dumbledore sees that Harry's eating Bertie Bott's beans and says, oh, those are Bertie Bott's beans. I was very unfortunate enough to get a booger flavored one early in my life, and I've never had one since. So let me try another one, because I know that the good flavors outnumber the bad. So hopefully I'll get a Scotch Mallow or some British, or a toffee or something. So he picks one out at random, puts it in his mouth and chews it and says, "Alas, earwax," and then just walks out. I've always thought that was a wonderful exit line for a character, particularly one like Dumbledore. And the first one I happened to get was earwax. And so I turned to my sister and said, "Alas, earwax." A little bit of digression humor. But the food is used as humor in J.K. Rowling. I mean, she kind of punctuates tension sometimes. There's often a kind of a high thing. Then they go and feast at the Great Hall. And she describes all these kind of dishes, and we kind of relax a little bit. It's the falling tension, and then it's time for her to ratchet it back up. She's actually a really good author, by the way. If you've never read any of her stuff, she's not just a young adult fantasy writer. There's a lot of complexity to what it is that she's doing, and she uses food very interestingly. Same thing with the Song of Ice and Fire. It's a very emotional text. There's lots of things happening, lots of political maneuvering. It's sort of almost like Harry Potter, but with the magic definitely in the background, and a little bit more political, and people killing each other all the time. But he also uses food as kind of almost as a backdrop to political maneuvering. The food is often at feasts and meals, and people are often hosting each other at meals to try to kind of take their temperature. Like, you don't want to say like, I'm plotting to overthrow the king. Are you interested? But you ask questions like, so what did you think about the king? Over the first course, and then George R. R. Martin will describe the course, and food almost becomes this opportunity to tilt, almost have sword fights with words to kind of try to figure out where people are, these ever shifting alliances. He does very well at kind of cutting the dialogue so it doesn't become too dialogue heavy, and cutting the kind of the political tension of by describing these scrumptious feasts. And the difference with his is, like I said, the Chronicles of Narnia, they often seem to me very kind of Middle Eastern, almost like you would find in Lebanon or Damascus or Istanbul, things that places like that. In Harry Potter, it's much more fanciful. These are dishes that we've never heard of before, and they're magic, and they levitating pitchers of butterbeer and pumpkin juice. Song of Ice and Fire is much more medieval. He goes to great pains to everything sweetened with honey. There is no sugar. He goes to great pains to basically have this be essentially with foodstuffs that you could find in medieval Britain. Okay, and there are references to like the island or the kingdom of Dorne, which has more spices, more spicy food. They have chili peppers. So it's not exactly the same as medieval Britain, but it is sort of like medieval Europe. And a lot of his dishes, as it turns out, he actually has a book that he published, which is the cookbook for the World of Ice and Fire. He actually did a lot of research into medieval dishes, and a lot of those medieval dishes are his sort of little twist on those. And then, of course, we get the purely fanciful, which is the Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. Written a long time ago, I believe during was it after the Great Depression or even during the Great Depression? Maybe it was a little bit after. But he clearly was appealing to a group of kids that didn't have a lot to eat, were obsessed with candy that they could never get their hands on, and this whole sort of winning the golden ticket thing, sort of like getting invited into this world where sort of almost you get adopted, but it's better than just getting adopted by Daddy Warbucks. It's getting adopted by Daddy Warbucks, who runs a chocolate factory. So you just get to eat candy all day long. I mean, poor Willy Wonka is diabetic at the age of 30. He's lost his foot by the age of 35 and has horrible diabetic nerve damage in his other foot, and is blind from diabetic at the age of 40 and dies of kidney disease at the age of 45. I'm convinced. Because, you just don't want to be a kid living in a candy factory. But, it is this kind of symbol of plenty and of spontaneity. It almost is kind of the Charles Dickens tale, but just kind of carried forth into the 20th century and completely centered around, sugar. There are implications, and people have written academic papers about what happens to these other kids, that they actually end up in the candy, that they actually become part of the candy that gets distributed. The other kids that go with Charlie, whatever his name is, I can't think of what his name is, to Willy Wonka's chocolate factory. So literature has a long, I just threw a few examples in here and tried to focus on the 20th century popular texts that you might have read about or at least heard of. But food is very, very common, describing teas and Jane Austen, and there's Shakespeare was very obsessed with food. It's a human thing. People who write literature are trying to connect central aspects of the human experience, and there's very little that's more central than food. We all don't believe the same thing, but we all have to eat or else we're going to die. Music is a little bit different. Musical forms are much shorter. You don't have nearly as much time to say anything. And, as I was doing research for this, I just kept thinking to myself, almost all the examples that I'm finding are using food as a metaphor. Okay. Sometimes they're talking about food as food. Sometimes they're talking about um, something else. And I'll give you a few examples. My milkshake brings all the boys to the yard. I'm not going to sing any more of Kelly's song. Pound cake, cherry pie. These are all thinly veiled, and brown sugar as well, thinly veiled sexual references. And food often serves that function. Not all songs about food that are metaphorical involve sex, but it seems to be a fairly common theme. I mean, there's a lot of kids songs that just talk about food, but I'm talking now more about sort of adult song. The Beatles' "Strawberry Fields Forever." Nobody really knows, but I mean, there are theories that it's a drug reference, and that seems to be a pretty commonly held theme. That it's either a drug reference from the rash you get from injecting drugs, or more than likely it's part of the Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. The sort of metaphor for dropping acid, and having these kind of vivid dreams. Tutti Frutti, okay, is a Little Richard song. I'm not exactly sure what it means. I'm not sure Little Richard knew what it meant, but it does seem to be tied up with. Number one, it makes for a clever catch for the for the chorus, but number two, it's wrapped around the story of I had a girl named Sue. Wait, no. Is it Sue, Daisy, and there's there's a progression between the choruses of women that this guy meets. Okay, so again, is it a sexual reference or not? Who knows? But a lot of these food references are kind of wrapped around meeting women. Particularly if it's a guy singing, and so that's just kind of an interesting association, so to speak. Brown Sugar by the Rolling Stones, Cherry Pie by Warrant, Pound Cake by Van Halen, Milkshake by Kelly's. I'm not sure who sang Lollipop, okay, or Sugar Pie Honey Bunch, okay. But a lot of these songs are, I mean, I think it's a way of talking about human sexuality, and often when I say human sexuality, very kind of low level. I mean, Sugar Pie Honey Bunch isn't, you could play that to a 13-year-old kid, I mean, it's not smutty or anything of that nature. So either sometimes it's well hidden, or it is kind of PG-13. But I think it is a way of addressing an aspect of human sexuality that you might not be able to directly approach in song. Okay, so that's kind of one aspect of music that I wanted to talk about. The other one I want to talk about is food songs that we associate with ritual. Okay, I put two examples up here. One is Happy Birthday, and all the crazy, stupid Happy Birthday songs that are deployed by restaurants that are afraid of getting sued. Happy, happy birthday, happy, happy birthday. I mean, I just want to, go to the restroom until they're done. If I'm at a restaurant and they start singing one of these crazy happy birthday songs, but we associate happy birthday with cake in the United States. This is a sort of a Western European tradition that comes to us specifically through the British, but it's really a very common feature. The birthday cake, the blowing out of the candles, the singing beforehand. It's associated with your birthday. Okay, and so much so that they don't just come out and sing happy birthday at a restaurant. If they know it's your birthday, they bring you something. They bring you a little cupcake with they bring you a very small dessert, a cookie, or with a single candle inside of it. Clearly this is if they're giving away free food on your birthday at a restaurant, uh, clearly it's a ritual that has reached a certain level of cultural expectation. Another one at weddings. Weddings often involve food rituals. I think in the West they do to a lesser degree than they do in other countries, such as India, for instance, has a lot of food rituals. Um, but two that were that, that are common. I mean, one less so than the other, but the eating of the cake. You know, I eat cake and you eat cake, and I've seen it both ways. They feed each other cake, or you twist your arms and eat your own cake. But eating of cake after a couple gets married, for whatever reason, is an important food ritual. And then the throwing of the rice or bird seed, if you're being if you think you're being um, environmentally conscious. And as a bird watcher, I can tell you it really doesn't matter all that much. Yes, does rice does expand, but uh, you know, uh, birds' digestive tracts work so quickly. That rice is consumed before it even has a chance to plump up, probably. Furthermore, it's house sparrows that are going to be the ones picking it off the ground. They're an invasive species to North America. They don't belong here. So please throw rice, um, uh, so we can get rid of the house sparrow, and they will stop out competing our native songbirds. Okay, no more bird rants for the day. But happy birthday, um, weddings, and then I put another one in here: drinking songs. Okay, and this is not something that's translated to the United States. Okay, it's more a thing in the British Isles. It's part of our cultural history because it's not just the British Isles; it's Germany also. It's a very European thing, um, but it's not something that ever really caught on to quite the same degree in the United States. And there are drinking songs that come out of the 19th century, so clearly it was a thing in the United States at one point, but it was never the same as it was in Britain, and the rest of Europe, and it had pretty well evaporated. I mean, um, my family, I grew up Seventh Day Adventist in a family that did not believe in the consumption of alcohol. So it was always ironic to me. Well, not always, because as a kid you didn't even think about it. But when I got to be older, I thought that's weird. We didn't have a lot of money. We couldn't travel internationally. We just couldn't afford to do it. In fact, country, the first foreign country I went to, other than Mexico and Canada, where you can drive to easily, wasn't until I was 18 years old. Okay, and that was Ireland. First time I went in an airplane to visit a foreign country. But because my dad was a teacher and my mom was a housewife, we had all summers free, and we would just drive across the country. We would camp. Gas was cheap then. You could often camp for very, very cheap, and like we would literally camp for 3 weeks and then get one night in a motel, just so you could take showers without having to go find a hose or something. And we would sing. When you're driving, it's a 3,000-mile country. Okay, it takes a long time to get to Florida. If you're trying to get to South Florida, and of course we were bird watchers, so we wanted to get to South Florida and see some of the specialty birds down there. It takes a long time. It takes quite a while to get across the country. And so, we would sing songs and play games and stuff. And the one song that would always get us the furthest was 99 Bottles of Beer on the Wall. And it just never sort of occurred to me that why should we be singing this if we don't believe in the consumption of alcohol? Well, it was because at that point, it was the only drinking song that was sort of known in American society, because drinking songs had kind of evaporated. But I spent a year living in England in college, and I've been to Ireland, and you just go to a pub and there's people singing, and there's usually music, and people are singing along. It's a very kind of a public uh, bonding experience, and it's a real aspect of food and music. So it is an interesting one that just sort of never quite translated to the United States in quite the same way. I've traveled extensively throughout Mexico, and there's also yeah, we have clubs that have music going, but I mean, the sort of the live music thing is not nearly to the extent in the United States at bars and pubs and places like this as it is in Europe, as I've already established, or as in Mexico either. So we kind of have this unfortunate lack in our society of having live music in venues where people get together to consume either food or, in many cases, alcohol. Film, I just put a few films on here. I mean, a lot of films feature food, and some really don't. But if you've ever watched Ocean's 11, uh, Brad Pitt is eating something in every single scene. That was on purpose. The director said, let's have you be eating something in every single scene. It's just kind of an interesting moment. Um, Babette's Feast is, I think, the one that I put a clip on for you. This is this sort of inviting 12 people to dinner. Somebody comes into some money and uses it all to feed the village. And this village is an old village. They've all been their time out of mind, but they've kind of gotten to the point where they're no longer connected in the way that they used to be. And so it takes an immigrant from, I believe she's from France, to cook this meal for them all, to get them all at the same table, and to kind of strengthen the bonds, because I believe she's leaving after that. And it's a metaphor for the Last Supper of Jesus Christ, getting everyone together one more time before Jesus leaves. And it just has gorgeous preparation, gorgeous scenes of preparation of food. Okay, probably not as good though as the next one, which is Eat, Drink, Man, Woman, which is it's about a man, a cook, a chef, a high end chef who is losing a sense of taste, and he has these three daughters, all that are grown, and all are very, very busy, sometimes too busy to eat correctly, and who are kind of drifting apart away from their culture. And he's losing his culture, because if he's losing his taste, he can't create the food that connects him to his culture. And it's becoming harder and harder for his daughters to meet with him for dinner, and they're kind of getting sucked off into their own lives. And what's this all going to mean? This film was actually remade as Tortilla Soup. So if you've ever seen either of them, they're both really good. This is one of the rare examples where the remake is equally as good as the original. I think the original is a little bit better, but Tortilla Soup is a very, very good film nonetheless. And I actually think I had you watch. I mean, I think that opening scene from Eat, Drink, Man, Woman is probably the best food preparation scene I've seen in any movie ever. I don't know what the heck he's making, but it looks delicious. And I wish, I wish that, I could sit down on one of his meals. There's this wonderful scene. I don't know if it's in the scene that I sent to you, where his granddaughter walks to school every day and takes a little bit of a detour by her house, and she gives him the sandwich and the bag of chips or whatever, the processed foods that, and maybe even westernized foods that her mother has given her, and throws them in the trash, and gives her a traditional meal that she can then take to school. I always thought that was kind of a great scene as well. Chef came out a few years ago, sort of about rekindling the vitality in your life, about, a chef that's kind of fallen on hard-ish times and is kind of run out of passion almost kind of reawakening that passion through food preparation. My Dinner with Andre is a very famous scene, a very famous film. It's essentially just one big scene of two dudes eating at a restaurant. They haven't seen each other for a long time, and they're catching up about life. And it's actually a fascinating film. It sounds boring, but it came out, and I do think it's a little much to sit through, but you kind of can get wrapped up in what they're eat. It's less about the food, and it's more about dinner as a social element and a canvas against which people rekindle relationships, maintain relationships, form new relationships, and is kind of a stalwart film in the sort of the realist genre of film. Julie and Julia, about Julia Child, so a sort of a somewhat true-ish, somewhat fictionalized biopic of Julia Child. One that came out maybe about 10 years ago now, maybe about 8 years, somewhere around in there, called The 100-Foot Journey, which is about an immigrant from India or Pakistan to, I can't remember what country they end up in, but he ends up wanting to open a restaurant. He's young, 100 feet away from a very well-known French restaurant run by, I can't think of the actress's name right now, but she's, of a generation above, older than him, maybe even a generation and a half, and kind of the competition between the two and eventual friendship. But it's all about cultural, blending of cuisines, blending of cultures, acceptance of immigrants, that type of thing. Chocolat, another foreign film. This one by a Danish director, but starring a French, and I think in French as well. So Chocolat. And then it's not really about food, but I could not resist Lady and the Tramp. The perfect food metaphor for overcoming shyness. This is the first time they ever kiss, was when they accidentally, they go to this restaurant and they're being basically served trash from trash receptacles. And Lady, there on the right, she comes from, obviously, she's well groomed. She's a Cocker Spaniel. She's got great hair. And she's got this medal. And then you have the Tramp, who's a mutt, who's a little rough around the edges. And, they're having an attraction for each other, but they come from, different backgrounds. And so they're being served this like remnant of a spaghetti dinner that somebody threw away. And they're eating out of the, they each take, they each eat and suck up spaghetti noodles until accidentally they both grab two opposite ends of the same one, and it ends in the kiss. That's Lady and the Tramp for you Disney fans out there. Okay, food is art. Paintings. Food actually does appear quite a bit before still life. Remember I mentioned that there was a period of time where really all that you were allowed to do aesthetically was paint Bible stories, and a lot of the Bible stories that were painted were ones that involved food, or sometimes they didn't. It wasn't a meal, but there would be a bunch of grapes. Remember, grapes are a symbol of sweetness, but they're also then they sour and become fermented. So, grapes kind of become, different foodstuffs have different metaphorical properties that these painters were kind of injecting into these scenes. Of course, then we come forward a couple hundred years after that medieval period to, a couple hundred years ago, and you get something called still life, which is, we're going to be painting objects. We're not going to be painting landscapes. We're not going to be painting people so much. We're going to be painting these usually indoor, not always, but usually indoor vistas of the domestic space. And often in the foreground will be a bowl of fruit or, a couple of hanging ham hocks or, who knows what, but some food item, okay? Because this is, number one, something you're going to find in the domestic space. And number two, everyone is interested in food. So if you're not going to have religious stories carrying your narrative, why not have the imminent food preparation of the meal? And that was still life. Um, I like to point out that Andy Warhol's soup cans are still life for the 20th century because his soup cans are essentially still life, but he's making a commentary about the fact that it's our food is processed, it's canned in tins, it's very, very uniform. I mean, you know, if you eat one apple, it's not necessarily the same as the next. Now, our food is a lot more uniform today than it used to be. Okay, but if you go back long enough, you get a bunch of apples, and they you bite into one apple, it's great. The next apple, not so much. Every single can of Campbell's tomato soup is exactly the same as long as it hasn't gone past the expiration date, more or less. I mean, he's basically saying there's a uniformity and a processed nature of our food today, but this is our food today. Uh, and then he abstracts it because I think what he's really saying is food used to be this organic thing that made its way from field or slaughterhouse into our kitchens with very little lead time because you didn't have preservatives and whatnot. They hadn't bioengineered bananas to last 3 times as long. You picked something, you slaughtered something, you ate it the next day at the very latest. You went shopping every day, and now you can go shopping and buy up enough food for the next 3 months if you really wanted to. So, everyone derides Andy Warhol for his soup can. Oh, he just painted a soup can. I think he was genius, actually. Okay, I think he was really making an ironic commentary about our own era and basically saying, "Hey, look, guys, this is the new still life." Then there's another one called the Futurist Cookbook, which comes from the 1930s. It is this from this group of people that their attempt was to be controversial. I mean, I don't like them very much because I mean, they're interesting to read about, but a lot of their stuff, they're not serious. At one point they had this thing called the Futurist Manifesto, and there is no more beautiful expression than death, and the machine gun is the flower of I mean, literally, that's what they were. I mean, I remember they actually do talk about the machine gun being a flower. It has this wonderful stem of iron that will never grow old, and um, it sprouts this fiery petals that bring truth to people when it comes to their mortality. I mean, just kind of like junk like that. That one was like from 1915, and it's called the Futurist Manifesto. And I think they were largely Italian and French, if I remember correctly. And one of his names was Marinetti. Well, it's hard to keep in the unless you're Kim Kardashian. It's hard to be controversial and in the public eye for too long, particularly back then. And so he tries various other projects, and none of them really catch on until he writes one called the Futurist Cookbook. And it's a little bit different. It actually does have food recipes in there, and they're kind of recipes for the modern age, and things of that nature. But I think one reason it caught on was it's food. Okay, by this point, these people are at that time period were sick of reading about these futurists and their various political ideologies. It's interesting. It's innovative the first time. It's interesting the second time, and it's just redundant and boring and stupid the third, fourth, fifth, the sixth, seventh, eighth, and ninth times. But then he came up with this cookbook, and so it was kind of a brief resurgence of the futurists and their kind of agenda of redefining everything for the mechanical age that they were trying to do in the first part of the 20th century. Even food as art. We talk about presentation. The French talk about it a lot, and so do the Italians. Americans not so much. British not so much. Here's your kidney. Here's your shepherd's pie. Plonk. Okay. Here's your hamburger. Yeah, we may put it in a basket and make it look a little cool, but we don't have the same concept of the French are very the French are very cognizant of appealing to all the senses, and let's see if I can do this. I can't remember the whole French ritual of how you drink wine is supposedly in an attempt to engage all the senses. The first is the smelling of the bouquet, um, and then the clink of the glasses before you drink is uh, about sound. And then, when you're smelling it, you're also you smell it, and then you look at the bottom of it as you do this, because you can see the tannins swirling about, or whatever it is. I'm not sure if it's the tannins or the whatever. Uh, but there's a visual aspect to it. Then you clink, then you hear, and then you put it in your mouth and swirl it all around. So it's about touch and taste. And so the French are very kind of concerned with the look, and it's not just about taste; it's about these other kind of sensory aspects. And so the sort of the dripped sauce that makes these little swirls and designs, adds another $10 to whatever you were going to pay. Um, you know, Yet I'm very middle class when it comes to my food. I like going to fancy restaurants, and I go occasionally, but to me, it's just not worth the money that I spend. I also like to go to hole in the wall places that a lot of students wouldn't, uh, a lot of people, I should say, wouldn't be caught dead going to. Um, but there is something fascinating to going to one of these places every once in a while, and seeing that it's a different concept. It really is a different concept. And there's often I think the American style is small plate, big food. Okay, you just put everything you can, so you really don't have any room to put your ketchup if you don't, if you want it for your fries. Whereas if you go to a French restaurant, there's going to be a few courses, smaller portions. And the smaller portions allow you to do different things with garnish and different things with the sauces that they drip around in certain patterns. It becomes more a palette of artistic palette before your food palette. Okay. So presentation is something that is used in haute cuisine, and there's been a sort of a filter down. I mean, you go to even like an Applebee's or a Red Robin, and they're going to try to make it look attractive on your plate. There's going to be a sort of a schema of how it's called plating. I never heard about plating when I was a kid. It just wasn't a term that people talked about when you were making your own food or cooking channels or whatever. Actually, I didn't even have a cooking channel when I was a kid, but plating is a concept that you read about. Garnish with this. That sort of wasn't an American mindset in the 30s or the 50s or the 70s. It's kind of more a thing that started in the 90s when the growth of cable TV and niche programming, the growth of the food channel, and people starting to diversify what they made and cooked away from just like more standard stuff to more experimental stuff. They kind of had these, hey, you need to dress it up a little bit. Okay. So presentation. And then finally, I put in here edible arrangements. I think I had to go to a website. This stuff's expensive, but it's good. I got one time. And it was fun. This looks like a daisy, but it's made out of cantaloupe and, pineapple. But that you can actually create. And I really think that you can find this in some sushi restaurants. They'll make it look like a flower, and then you eat it basically. There's one nearby that looks like a tomato. In fact, I think it's called the tomato sushi. That one's very. Is that like a shy or high or something like that sushi? They have one called the tomato, and it looks like a tomato. It's all made up out of fish and rice, but it looks like a tomato. Media, the next three kind of all blend into one another: media, advertisements, and slogans. Media, Sears Roebuck discovered that if they put pictures next to like certain goods, they sold better. Okay, if you're talking about a lantern and you show people what it looks like, they're more likely to buy the lantern. Okay, and you wouldn't think that this would apply to food, because if I want to buy a barrel of flour, it's just a barrel of flour. Who cares? But that this was also part of their discovery, that people felt more connected to things they could see. even if it's an illustration, if it said it's a fine quality flour, cooking flour, and then you see this barrel, and hey, that does look like it's high quality. And look at that nice loaf of bread next there that they made. If we buy 55 gallons worth of flour, we'll be able to make this nice bread too. And so, Sears Roebuck started putting more and more illustrations in to sell their products, and included among that was certain staples of food that didn't spoil, that you could ship easily, and things like salted beef and whatnot. Newspapers would do the same thing. You go back and look at newspapers from newspapers today don't tend to have a lot of food advertisements, and neither do magazines for that matter. They have alcohol. The only food or consumption, I'm putting beverages in there too, that magazines tend to sell is alcohol. Okay. Well, the reason why is because we have another form of media, television, where we get most of our food advertisements. Well, before TV, radio ran food ads. Before that, periodicals and newspapers did. I actually, the sad thing was I was going to do the library display this spring, and it was going to be the history of donuts. So we'll have to see if we ever do that again, if that happens next year. Particularly since I bought a whole bunch of donut memorabilia and, a Homer Simpson piggy bank and all sorts of crazy stuff I was going to put in there. But, one thing that I discovered as I was buying, you could find old newspapers pretty cheap. And I found all these donut ads that were in newspapers. You'd never see that today. So, newspaper and magazine ads lead to radio spots and billboards along highways with the growth of car culture, and eventually to television, which is sort of the height of food media. Okay, yes, there are in the internet and social media there are examples of food advertisement and food media, but television is still the quintessential. I mean, most of the slogans that we can name are, if not all, are from, and I put some of them down below, but there's others like Mikey Likes It. You probably don't remember that because you're too young, but that was Life cereal. I mean, it was a huge one for Kix. Kid tested, mother approved. Okay, they're great. Tony the Tiger from Frosted Flakes. I'm just existing within the world of Honey Nut Cheerios. I can still sing some of these songs. Honey Bunches of Oats, Golden Grams. Oh, those golden grams. Those are all cereals. That's all I just did right now with cereals. We can probably all sing about 40 different examples of commercial spots from television in between your morning cartoons or in between Gilligan's Island or whatever TV show you're watching at the time. Okay, so TV is kind of the epitome of. Now there are influencers. The amazing thing was I was in. I'd never been to Asia until about 3 years ago, and I've been lucky to spend 3 weeks in Thailand and about 10 days in Taiwan within the last three. I was just astonished. I was walking around and there's Bruce Willis selling an energy drink. Having this Mandarin or Cantonese text come out of his mouth. Arnold Schwarzenegger is selling this. Leonardo DiCaprio. I mean, it's interesting who the social influencers are in abroad, selling food. But even on. Do you remember when George Clooney got a partial stake in, along with, I think it was Julia Roberts' husband? Is that right? Or was it Cindy Crawford's husband? It was one of those two. The two of them just decided we're going to buy this stake for like $1 million each or something in a tequila company. Okay. And like a year later, they sold it for $1 billion. And it was simply because George Clooney was photographed drinking this one tequila and was associated with this one tequila. He wasn't even doing commercials. This was just sort of like product placement in his life. And it sold the brand to the point they didn't own the whole thing. So they didn't each make $1 million, but $1 billion or even $500 million. But, they took something, bought into this tiny little company no one had ever heard of, and then just through rich, powerful, famous people, product placement, influencers, all of a sudden a year later, maybe it's a couple years, uh, they cash out like bandits. So, a few advertisements I think bear, some have been very smart. Budweiser, uh, has gone through just clever, they'll come up with something and they'll get like 3, 4, or 5 years out of it. Like for instance, I remember when they did the Bud Bowl during, they'd have Bud versus Bud Light, these long neck bottles playing football, dropping back with no arms. I don't know how they threw a forward pass without arms. Even Tyrannosaurus Rex has tiny little arms. These guys didn't have any. Throwing passes, and there'd be a fumble, and they'd all jump on the pile, and this would play out during the Super Bowl, and either Bud or Bud Light would win the Super Bowl, the Bud Bowl. Well, that went for 3 or 4 years until people started to get sick of it, and then they introduced the frogs, Bud, Wise, these three frogs that each say one of the syllables, and at first they're completely discordant, and eventually they form the word Budweiser. Well, that was good for 3 or 4 years, and then they had this one. I thought it was the stupid one. They had the guys, "What's up? What's up? What's up?" I guess it was kind of funny because then they had an alien come to Earth and look around imperiously and then go, "What's up?" Budweiser's been very clever about. I don't think they're putting as much money into advertising now as they used to, but they used to put a lot of money into it. And the Super Bowl was sort of like everyone was like, okay, number one, who's going to win the Super Bowl, and number two, what's Budweiser going to do? That was like on everybody's mind. The beer companies have always been very, very clever at advertising, and advertising does impact young viewers. I mean, they are trying to find the who's going to be using their product in the future. Some other ones, Cuisinart, I talked about a couple weeks ago, or maybe even last week, as being this. They were advertising as we're top line, and they were. And the problem was they were so top line that their products never broke. So people would buy one, they never have to get one for the rest of their life. So you want to pretend sometimes to be top line, but not necessarily follow through on it. You don't want to make your product price point so high because you want it to be more manageable for people, and you want them to be able to afford to buy a new one in the future if they so need to. Absolute Vodka, I think I had you look through a series of very clever references to other locations that Absolute was trying to do to certain cities. An absolute bottle that looks like the Eiffel Tower, to certain references to artwork, to certain cultural references. I mean, what they're really establishing themselves is we're the vodka of. We're not the vodka where you're 16 and break into your dad's liquor cabinet and get some orange juice and, get drunk and, whatever. We're the type of vodka that's about sophistication, that's about culture, that's about class. It's meant for people that appreciate travel, who appreciate cultural references and things of that nature. And it was very popular at the time. It won all these advertising awards, and it was interesting that when the ad people freak out over an ad line, that it's been successful. And Absolute Vodka was sort of definitional for sort of almost a generation when it came to quality of advertising. One that was very, very successful that I just always thought was hilarious was The Most Interesting Man in the World. And they were always better on the radio, I thought, than the television. Because the guy started aging, okay? And, they're saying all these, they're trying to have him surfing on TV and stuff, and it just didn't look real. He was kind of getting on in years. It was a little aged. But he has that wonderful voice, that actor. I can't remember what his name is. And, he had some other roles that he did, but this is the one he's famous for, selling Dos Equis beers, The Most Interesting Man in the World. And they were just so funny. I mean, it was like, his beard once uh, his beard once solved the problem of relativity, and received an honorary PhD doctorate degree or something. I mean, just kind of like ridiculous stuff like that. That was just kind of very, very hilarious. Did it have anything to do with beer? Absolutely not. Neither do three frogs either. But that's the thing, is that if you're very, very clever, you can doesn't really have to be about your product, as long as you can, you bait and switch. You pull them in with this narrative, and then you somehow switch over to, well, this guy's the most interesting because he drinks this beer, Dos Equis. The chicken sandwich wars was very interesting to see this kind of back and forth. I've often thought Chick-fil-A does a really good job of advertising. I mean, they've had the same ad campaign for like 25 years or 30 years, which is astonishing. They eat more chicken cows. I mean, they play variations on that theme, but there's not a lot of variations you can play on cows trying to convince you to eat chicken. Okay. And so it was interesting when Popeyes decided to go after Chick-fil-A. And, what very quickly emerged was there was this kind of class aspect to this. And there was advertisement that was kind of more geared towards tradition versus sort of new hip mainstream today's culture. I thought Popeyes did a really good job at maneuvering the levers of Twitter, and they definitely won the Twitter battle. I mean, the example of that, and the fact that Chick-fil-A didn't really understand how to use Twitter, is when on a Saturday, Chick-fil-A, the parent company, sent out this tweet kind of cracking back on Popeyes and said, if come tomorrow to one of our locations and you'll see why we're better, which just opened the floodgates of scorn, because all these people were saying to Chick-fil-A, don't you know that you're closed on Sunday, because of your religious, you're foisting your religious views on other people. I mean, they just walked right into the propeller blade on that one. And so Popeyes was just like dominating on that aspect of things. But I was conducting research. I actually did conduct research. I did back to back, where I would eat 2 chicken sandwiches in a row at the different places, and then I'd reverse them. And I did this like for months. Between those two and a place called Birdie's in Norco, which is the best, by the way. It's better than Popeyes, and Popeyes, yes, is better than Chick-fil-A. But where Chick-fil-A won is that Popeyes would occasionally run out of chicken sandwiches, and people get angry, and they didn't understand their formula yet, whereas Chick-fil-A perfectly understood and knows how to plan, because they relied on tradition. So there was this kind of tradition versus sort of new and novel. And then I mentioned the class one also. There is something kind of white about Chick-fil-A. I go there and, this is Southern California. It's a place of great diversity. And you do see people from all sorts of backgrounds in Chick-fil-A. But it's much more, their clientele is, I think, a little bit more conservative, a little bit more white, perhaps a little. I would think maybe from a slightly higher kind of on average socioeconomic status. I think I mentioned a little bit more politically conservative. Okay, and when I'm in Popeyes, it seems like it's a little bit more working class. It's a little bit more diverse. I kind of get the feel that I'm in an area where I can't quite easily put my finger on the pulse of the politics, although I think it's probably a little bit more diverse. You just kind of get the sense, and people have talked about this. I'm not the only one that's noticed this. I've read articles about this, heard other people talk about it. No one's done any studies or anything of that nature, but it is kind of a different feel when you're at Popeyes. It seems like I'm seeing more representative of Southern California when it comes to a mixture of ideologies, race, ethnicity, class. Whereas, although by no means monolithic, Chick-fil-A seems like it's a little bit more pitched towards a certain demographic. Okay. Same thing when I go to Cracker Barrel. I mean, is a diversity of people in Cracker Barrel, but when I go to Cracker Barrel, I sort of feel like I'm like in the South where most people are white and or whatever. Ben and Jerry's, I think it's a really interesting. Here's yet another aspect of advertising. There are people that match their ethic as a food company in the way that they view food consumption and food preparation and the entire length of the food chain with their advertising. And Ben and Jerry's is definitely one of those. And I'm not talking so much about the fair trade label, but they make this whole pitch about inclusivity and diversity and sort of all the flavors of that really there is this kind of merge between flavors of humanity and the flavors of their ice cream, but it goes a step further in their design. They tend to have these very colorful designs that have not all the colors of the rainbow, and certainly not all as a rainbow, but various there's greens and yellows, and there's often a little bit of red and blue, and it's almost like a rainbow. It's almost like there's a diversity of design. Now, is that purposeful or not? I'm not sure, but it's definitely courting a different type of thing than Haagen-Dazs, which is white and brown. Haagen-Dazs is more European austerity, whereas this is more about the more diverse elements of the American experience, but we probably more experience in California and big cities. Okay, more West Coast, East Coast type thing. So Ben and Jerry's is kind of like a weird happy medium between they rarely, Ben and Jerry's does not have, they have vanilla and they have chocolate and they have coffee. They don't tend to have a singular ice cream flavor like a lot of the other. They often have a lot of stuff in there. There's a diversity and variety of tastes. There's a diversity and variety of political ideologies that they invoke on their packaging. And there's a diversity when it comes to the colors and schemes of their, everything kind of meshes together with Ben and Jerry's. And I started teaching Ben and Jerry's cartons 24 years ago when I first taught a class at La Sierra University, actually in freshman English, in the English department. And, even then, without the vocabularies that I have today, I understood that something interesting was going on. I didn't fully kind of understand, but very clearly there was this kind of happy medium of ideas and forms and ingredients going on with Ben and Jerry's. Finally, I think there's a lot of slogans that bear mentioning. I'll go from bottom to top because I want to end with Coke and Pepsi. Got milk is not grammatically correct. Okay, I hate the word got. Have milk is probably, and furthermore, it's an incomplete sentence. Okay, so they didn't do any favor to the English teachers of the world, but it's a very short, it's very memorable, and they would do the milk mustaches with the got milk, and this was the milk industry, not Altadena or specific companies, but this was an example of a food lobby pumping money into advertising, and it worked. More people began to drink milk because of that ad. They would focus on bones, they'd focus on teeth, they'd focus on other things, but the trying to appeal to people's health was one thing. But what was far more successful was get a celebrity that people recognize, paint a little milk mustache on them, and just have a very quick, easy, memorable tagline that people can sort of cling to, and it was very, very successful. Taco Bell, has had a number of very memorable ones. They've had ones that border on the racist that I put down here. At the time, I don't think that many people considered it racist, unless, of course, they came from a Chicanx or even a Latinx background. Okay, I think the mainstream thought this is being culturally sensitive by employing by employing a Spanish tagline, "Yo quiero Taco Bell." But having a Chihuahua do it, and I mean, it just the iconography of it and the sort of the stereotyping of it. Today we look back and cringe. At that point, it was only people of that background and people in academia, mostly in history departments and and political science departments and maybe English departments too. The sort of the liberal arm of academia that were kind of cringing a little bit. I'll be honest, I didn't think much about it at first until my best friend is from Mexico. He was kind of griping about it one day, and I was like, yeah, you're right. That is kind of having a Chihuahua kind of spout off this line. Can you imagine if there were other aspects of race and stereotyping happening? In some cases, people would say, "Hey, this is going too far," but for this one, they weren't at the time. Even having the Chihuahua itself before the Chihuahua was saying these lines in Spanish was a little bit of an issue, particularly since we already established Taco Bell's American, or at least Americanized Mexican food. It's not real Mexican food. Going to Taco Bell, I've always felt I have more in common with going to McDonald's than I do going to a taqueria. I think the one "Think Outside the Bun" was a much more socially acceptable tagline, but it was very directed at McDonald's and to a lesser extent Wendy's and Burger King. And that was very clever. "Think outside the box" is a phrase everybody knows. It's a phrase that's been used for generations and people still use it. Your grandmother knows it, your great grandmother, your parents, know it. Your little niece or nephew that was born yesterday will know it. It's just a very common phrase. And so it's one that appealed to everyone, and they just tweaked it just a tiny little bit. It was very clever advertising. American runs on Dunkin', which has a very clever reference to coffee as fuel for the human. I've always thought that was very, very clever. So sometimes you kind of almost are playing up the fact that we live in this culture that most of us have identified on the discussion boards as not being a good culture. We rush. We're always on the go. We don't have time to eat. I'm embarrassed to say that there have been times in my life I've been so busy that I eat meals in the morning standing next to the kitchen sink. I don't take time to sit down. I go through a drive-through for lunch. And then maybe I sit down at the end of the day. But I eat two of my meals either not sitting down or sitting down in a vehicle during lunch. Going to a fast food place. And this is kind of playing into that. That we are machines that need to go, and much like your car needs gas to go. Gas from Exxon to go. The human body needs coffee to go. Very clever, although I don't like the fact that it's accepting this aspect of American culture. I'd like to get back to the slow food. Miller, less filling, tastes great. This is one of the few times Miller actually got out ahead of Budweiser with their advertising. But, the less filling tastes great debate where you had these two people at a bar like, I drink Miller Lite because it's less filling. And the other guy says, I drink it because it tastes great. It's less filling. It tastes great. Less filling. Tastes great. Having this kind of running argument. And what that does is these guys get closer and closer to perceived conflict before it ends and says, Miller tastes great and it's less filling. Is that, I'll probably be in midst dementia in my mid 80s on my deathbed, and I'll forget like all the names of all my loved ones. There is a dementia. There has been some dementia diseases in my family, so who knows genetically. Didn't mean for that somber digression, but I'll probably be like very peaceful and forgotten everything and perfectly happy, and I can't remember anything, but I'll be able to quote cartoons from the commercials from the TV commercials from the 1980s. This stuff gets fixed in your mind. These less filling taste great. It was very genius because it's getting to, hey, look, we have half the calories, so you can save. You're not going to put on so much weight if you drink a bunch of beer, but we still have that great taste that Miller's known for. So you're getting the best of both worlds, and it solidifies itself in people's mind. Where's the beef was Wendy's um, attack on, full frontal attack on Burger King and McDonald's, and it was very successful because it had this old woman, who goes and looks down at this burger store that's probably supposed to be McDonald's, looks at this tiny little burger, looks up the dude and says, "Where's the beef?" Kind of in this angry, affronted tone. And, this was the grandma who was going to call BS on you and me and everyone else for that matter. And everyone loved her. She became this kind of unlikely star at the end of her life. She actually died not that long after it, but she'd been this like character actress that never had caught on, never made a break, and was like now in her 70s or whatever. I can't remember. I was a kid when this came out. And it was just, I can't tell you how many people were running around the playground saying, "Where's the beef?" And you get back a paper from, like in junior high, from the English teacher who would write there, "Where's the beef? This argument needs meat." Just kind of all these stupid, it was kind of annoying after a while. It was so successful that it just kind of got into the culture in kind of bizarre and unexpected ways. But it was very clever because its appeal, now that I look back on it, was the sort of the grumpy old person who's people when they're very young or very old are willing to call BS. Okay, it's the whole but the emperor has no clothes. Anecdote. Who's willing to say that? Young people because they don't know better, and old people because they don't care what other people think of them. And in this case, it was calling out advertisers for showing you this big Big Mac, and then when you get there, it's this kind of limp, tiny little sandwich missing the beef. That was a very successful ad. They kind of appealed to a different thing. And then the one I want to end on, because I've been talking about this for years. This was one of my first lectures that I ever developed at La Sierra University 24 years ago. And at that point, it doesn't translate as well today with the current mottos and slogans. But the interesting thing is, if you look back at all their slogans and mottos, Coca-Cola doesn't change that much. Okay, and even when they do, it's a very consistent theme. They're promoting tradition, the fact that we don't change. It's the same Coke now that your grandfather drank. And the quintessential tagline that's their most consistent slogan throughout their now 100 plus year history is always Coca-Cola. Okay. Now the formula has changed. It was called Coca-Cola because it at one point did, in the 19th century, have cocaine in it, or some derivative therein, or maybe it was codeine. I can't remember, but it was no, I think it was cocaine. Pepsi, on the other hand, is always trying to catch up to Coke. They're never successful. So they've tried a few things, and some have been kind of successful when they had the Pepsi Challenge, where they'd have these blind taste tests and things of that nature. But they can't do the tradition thing because Coke has the corner on that market, and so they kind of go a different direction, which is the choice of a new generation next. They're often making reference to future. It's almost like Coke has cornered the past. We're going to try to differentiate ourselves by looking to the future. And, that just kind of illustrates the main difference between the two when it comes to their slogans. Coke has that kind of red with the white background. It's very catchy. Pepsi tries to play, for a long time, it was red, white, and blue. Mostly white, but with red and blue on it. Sort of going more for a patriotic feel. But then in more later times, it's been more a cool blue, okay, so Coke goes kind of like bright red, more emotional, more visceral, not anger, not about anger or lust or anything like that, but just eye-catching, sort of emotional. Whereas Pepsi then has to go the other direction, which is kind of like a cool, laid back. We're the cool, laid back choice of young people. Is basically what they're trying to accomplish. Um, so Coke and Pepsi, I think, are very, very interesting in the ways that they have sought to differentiate themselves. Of course, Pepsi is aided by the fact that RC Cola, which I'm guessing many of you have never even drank, has really been in decline since the 1960s and 70s. And RC Cola used to have that blue cool thing, and Pepsi sort of couldn't go into their market. They even may have merged at one point. But now that RC Cola is a very niche product, Pepsi can take that sort of blue, cool look. So Coke and Pepsi, I've always thought make for a really interesting dichotomy of strategies when it comes to aesthetics and the way they look, and also when it comes to how they choose to market themselves. And even Coke. I mean, Coke just always wins. Even when they went away from their, even when they went away from their always Coca-Cola thing, and in the 1980s they made a mistake, and they changed the formula of Coke, and they called it New Coke. Everyone freaked out. I mean, it was like World War III was declared. I mean, it was in the news like every day for weeks on end, and nobody liked it essentially. So then what they did is, I mean, they won. I mean, that's the crazy thing about Coke. They're so smart as a company. They had this big announcement that they're going to keep New Coke because some people do like it, and particularly it's doing well in international markets, which it was. When you go over abroad now, you're drinking a formula that's much closer to New Coke than Old Coke. But when they brought back Old Coke, they didn't call it Old Coke. They didn't even call it Coke for a number of years. A couple of years at least. They called it Coke Classic, and so they worked the whole always Coca-Cola tradition thing into the word classic, and immediately they started outperforming Pepsi again. I mean, the one good thing Pepsi did is they paid Michael Jackson, I think $1 million if I remember correctly, which at that point was a huge amount of money, to like over a course of one day shoot a commercial. And the most notable thing about that, the only thing everyone ever remembers, I think people forget it was a Pepsi ad, is he accidentally lit his hair on fire. Or he didn't do it. The Pepsi did it. He was dancing down these steps, moonwalking down these steps, and they had these pyrotechnics going off, and his hair caught fire. And so they had to close down production for a couple weeks. This was a big scandal in news, and then they put a little hairpiece on him, and he finished the commercial. So that's all anyone remembered about that. So even when Coke makes a mistake, they come out winning. Even when Pepsi has a coup, like signing Michael Jackson to do a TV commercial, how often did that happen? The story becomes him lighting his hair on fire rather than their product. So that's how I will end this when it comes to the marketing portion of art, aesthetics, and marketing. This is week 9. We only have, unfortunately, 1 week to go.